Order. I'd like to welcome the second panel of the day. And I think probably easiest if we just start by you introducing yourselves, perhaps starting with you, Mr. Baker, and then we'll go into questions.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm James Baker. In my past, I worked for the No to ID campaign. I now work for an organisation called Open Rights Group, or ORG for short. We've been going about 20 years as a not-for-profit working on digital rights issues and human rights things, and most recently we undertook research with the University of Leicester and Warwick on a programme called Digitalising Identity that looked at the government's e-visa scheme.
Thank you very much. Silkie Carlo, I'm the director of Big Brother Watch. We're a privacy and civil liberties non-profit, non-party campaign group in the UK. I have engaged with the government over the past 10 years on digital identity matters in various forms, including being on the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group and engaging with the recent data bills on digital identity verification.
Hi, I'm Ruth Ehrlich. I'm the head of policy and campaigns at Liberty. Liberty is an independent membership organisation. We campaign to defend and extend civil liberties and human rights for everyone in the UK. We played a key role in the No to ID cards campaign back in the noughties, and then very happy to be back working on the issue in 2025.
Thank you very much. And thank you were in for the previous panel, so you've heard a lot of the questions, but we do have some specific questions for you, and I'm going to start with Margaret Mullane.
So could I ask what risk do you think the mandatory element of digital ID presents to somebody's privacy and other rights?
Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I'd say already we have digital ID already. It's mandatory for migrant workers in the UK under the e-visa scheme, and they already have to present a digital ID via their share codes in order to do work. And we've got real-world examples of where that mandatory scheme has been hurting people. People with the right to work in the UK have lost out on job opportunities because they've not been able to access their share codes or improving their right to work. We've had examples of people going into the shop to buy alcohol and being asked to show their e-visa share code in order to purchase alcohol, and they've been unable to do it. So I'd say where you have mandatory systems introduced like that, then it's not a hypothetical. We're already seeing real-world examples of exclusion in existence.
I would like to add to that. I think that the mandatory nature of the proposed digital ID scheme is really the heart of the problem. Digital identities are something that we all use every day in various different ways, but a government-issued mandatory digital ID has the potential to create a incredibly intrusive system of surveillance, data collection. It opens up possibilities for the government to issue and revoke permissions in certain ways. And I think where I disagree slightly about the e-visa, the e-visa scheme is something we should certainly talk about because it has been blighted with very serious issues, which has obstructed people from accessing essential services. But a visa is essentially a permit. We've never had nationals need to have a permit in this country to go about our everyday lives. And so the mandatory nature of what has been proposed would introduce that suddenly we would be a country that is on licence, that needs a government permit to do something that otherwise we would have the freedom to do. And I think in terms of giving people, and in fact why your inboxes are so full perhaps, is that mandatory nature of the ID coupled with a restriction on liberty, which is what the government has suggested, for something you would otherwise lawfully be able to do. Now, unless you have this digital ID card, you won't be able to work. And already other government departments are talking about renting, benefits, education, etc. So I think that we would be having a completely different conversation if the government were talking about a system it thought was so attractive that if it made it available, lots of people would want to use it. Instead, it's a mandatory system that is paired with restrictions on people's liberties.
And we have got questions on e-visas later, so if we can just focus on the specifics around the mandatory nature.
Yes, to echo that, Liberty would not support any mandatory digital ID system or any mandatory ID system. I think the key thing here is that the specific privacy risks depend solely on the decisions that the government makes now about what this system is going to look like. And there is a real opportunity here to create something that centres human rights, that centres privacy, that centres the way that people need and want to access their data, but going about it in a way that makes it a mandatory system that's forced upon people indeed to access something very basic like work, will prove a disaster for people on an individual level. But also there are the broader privacy risks that are raised by creating any kind of database that links to a digital ID system. And we know that in the past year alone, there's been a 50% increase in cybersecurity attacks. We've seen the massive impact of cybersecurity attacks like the Land Rover Jaguar case. So this process generally carries significant risk to privacy, cybersecurity, which I'm sure we'll touch on later on this panel.
Would you have any examples of individual rights in other countries that you feel have been affected by this?
I think when you look at the examples around the world
Digital
ID,
yeah.
Lots of countries who've introduced digital ID have had various issues and problems. You know, Estonia is often held up as this great example, but they had a problem with their chip certification, had to reissue all their chips. A small country of a couple of million people, if you had that kind of problem with a country the size of Britain, it would be hundreds of millions of pounds. You know, when they tried to introduce it in Greece, the ministry ended up getting fined by its data protection authority. Italy's had a data breach. Venezuela's had a data breach where they've got attacked. Brazil has, Turkey has. There's a whole host of issues around the world where people have suffered losses resulting from identity cybersecurity risks. Other places, people have faced kind of digital exclusion where they can't kind of prove their ID. There's both kind of plenty of historic examples where ID card systems have been used to marginalise or exclude people, sometimes unintentionally, other times intentionally.
Could you give me an example of an intentional?
Throughout, I mean, we'd be going back through to historic examples going way back in time, but throughout the 20th century, you know, there's plenty of examples of ID cards being used to exclude people on the basis of their identity or credentials.
Yeah, talking of the Aadhaar scheme in India, something that's often overlooked is that scheme has even been linked to citizen deaths through, for example, accessibility problems. That's a massive biometric identity system of over 1 billion people. And that has access issue, because it's required for access to welfare, access issues have been documented to have resulted in people actually dying. So incredibly serious consequences. Also, that system holds health data and has individuals have been refused healthcare because of their HIV/AIDS status, for instance, which is held on this digital identifier. But I do think we see examples of abuses closer to home as well. We've spoken about the cybersecurity risks. So when individuals are enrolled in mandatory systems, you lose that control over how you manage your data. You're relying on either the companies or the state. And Estonia, often held up as being the gold standard example, has suffered multiple cybersecurity incidents where people's photos have been leaked, etc. And on a more individual basis, for example, a police officer in Estonia was fined for checking his fiance's criminal record. So you get access problems as well, where people get unauthorised access to giant databases.
Yeah, and just building on that, and the Indian system, particularly in Aadhaar, it's using that ID system. You need it to pay your tax, have a bank account, book certain train tickets. It is part of every single bit of life. And when you think about people who live in remote areas, the people from the poorest communities, people who are illiterate, who have no digital connection, that's where people become increasingly locked out. And you touched in the earlier panel about some of those risks in the UK. I also just, examples closer to home, as Silkie mentioned, when we've looked at previous Home Office data projects, things have gone seriously wrong. When you look at the data breaches in the Windrush compensation scheme, Dame Chi mentioned the 25,000 Afghan nationals whose data was breached. There are already examples of where we are not holding people's data securely. And if you think to the creation of a system that looks like a centralised system or a federated system that has broad sharing powers between them, it poses huge risks.
And just finally, how do you see it going forward, a kind of a creep in digital ID, that people's privacy and human rights are at risk? Is that something that worries you?
It worries me. I mean, it was spoken about earlier that sometimes digital ID enables people to do things faster. And for this, I use the analogy of, lifts. You can get in a lift and it might get you faster up to a floor. But if something goes wrong with that lift, you still want the stairs as a backup system to be able to walk up and down. So it worries me both from a privacy point of view as to what a future government could do with it, and there's discussions as to how it could be used for this, it could be used for that. It isn't clear to me that the design scope is even clear to everyone yet. And I kind of think, imagine the person you disagree with most in politics, just picture them for a moment in your head. Imagine what they could do with this type of system if you didn't have the adequate safeguards in place. So that's why I think all of us who care about our rights and the security of the country ought to think about what systems can we put in place to stop that happening. And this is what worries me about introducing this in a country like the UK, is we don't have a written constitution that has privacy protections. It's a statute of Parliament, the Human Rights Act. We've got the Human Convention of Human Rights, but there's active talk about pulling us out of that convention at the moment. So I kind of worry that we haven't got enough of a resilient rights framework really to introduce this type of technology safely in a way which would prevent that risk that a future bad actor could misuse these systems, however good the intentions of the current people. So I'd say that, and from a resilience point of view, I think you need the backup systems. If your phone battery dies, if the server goes down, if a foreign government attacks your computer infrastructure, it's actually better for national security that you're not entirely reliant on one centralised ID system, but you have a multitude of multiple systems you can prove your ID. At the moment, if I lose one bit of my ID, I can re-establish it through a network. I can go to my bank, I lose my driver's license, I got my passport. With a centralised digital ID system, if something goes wrong with that, then you've lost everything and you've got no way to then prove and re-establish your identity. So I think that they're the risks that we have to avoid here.
We are incredibly worried about function creep with this system, and right from the off really, I think the warning signs have been there. This was introduced by the government as something ostensibly to tackle illegal working. I don't think anyone in this room genuinely believes that the mandatory digital ID is about illegal working, which begs the question, what is it really about, and what will the other uses be? Already, in the Friday afternoon that this was announced by the Prime Minister, just hours later, the government webpage about digital ID was talking about tax, benefits, education, childcare, many other uses for a digital ID. So function creep is inherent in the system, and I think people rightly be concerned about that. Even in the, I would have to correct myself actually. I said that we never have had a mandatory ID. There was the wartime ID cards, of course, but they, even they, which were initially issued for rationing, ended up sprawling to 39 government agencies before they were scrapped by the Churchill government. So it's inherent to any system. And the other side of what is so concerning about that, these other use cases, is again, if this is starting with the pairing of a restriction on liberty, what will the other restrictions be? In many people's minds in this country, the most recent experience of a digital pass was the COVID pass. And in that case, there were restrictions placed on people depending on where you could go and what you could do based on your vaccination status, for example. So there we saw a digital identity system that had very sensitive data that then controlled where you could go and what you could do, and was also seen by many to be an attempt to influence decisions. Again, in that case, certain people couldn't work in health and social care, for example, if you didn't have the right vaccination status. So I think function creep is both inevitable and an overriding concern with this system.
Yes, and I would add to that in terms of the kind of risks of function creep. Again, much of this is in the hands of the government now. They can make policy choices that mitigate these risks and that create a system that is voluntary and that works for people who choose to use it. But one of the core features that this system would need to have in order to make sure that the function creep wasn't extremely detrimental to people's rights and civil liberties is to make sure that the government is not able to link previously separate data sets, which if linked, would essentially allow the authorities to build a very detailed, intimate picture of a person based on their healthcare, their education, their access to welfare, other public services. And living in an age where increasingly we're seeing predictive algorithms for public decision making, particularly we have lots of examples from the Department for Work and Pensions where that kind of algorithmic decision making has created serious harm for people who are accessing welfare, risk assessments causing 200,000 people to be incorrectly flagged for housing benefit fraud, which led to difficulties in paying their rent. So we can already see the risks when you introduce digital systems that are based on algorithms. If you allow for all of those data sets to be combined, then that could be very risky for people's human rights.
Thank you. Gianmora.
Thank you very much. The concerns that you've raised are ones which I know are sort of echoed by my constituents, and I do wonder what kind of safeguards might help reassure you and my citizens about a digital ID scheme, which does have its advantages to it. And so, for example, I mean, can you think of examples which would help? And so, for example, we've talked about perhaps the option to delete all your data that's held by government at one time, or and I think this is the Estonian model, that each time your data is accessed, you have some kind of, you're told when your data is accessed, which isn't the case now. I mean, I don't know who in government's looking at my data. But do you think those would help reassure you and help reassure the public about a digital ID?
I mean, there are things that you can do to design systems which are more privacy-centric and focus and restore some trust. I think part of the problem we have in the UK is people generally have low trust that when something goes wrong with their data, it will be well regulated and action will be taken. You see that with things like the Afghan data breach and the number of government data breaches in general. There's low trust there in the whole kind of information security environment. Part of the problem with that is we have a data protection information commissioner who is reluctant to take action against government departments or organisations. So CEOs do not prioritise. That's part of it. The point you make about the logs, being able to see who has accessed a record and for what purposes, that's really important. However, we also have to acknowledge that we live in a legal system where authorities can also check and access people's information essentially in secret through things like Investigatory Powers Act or RIPA, so people may not even know when their files are being accessed. Things like that would help. I think like not having it as a centralised system, having it something where government could issue a credential to a wallet that you could see as open source. You could maybe like even build that wallet yourself if it met the framework and met that. Maybe it could be issued to something like your Apple or Google. It was a credential, it's a driver's license, rather than an all singing, all dancing ID system. Part of the problem here is the point mentioned about algorithmic data sharing. Quite often, issues of data sharing, moving government together, get conflated with this issue of issuing a credential to a digital wallet. So when we talk about digital ID, suddenly we're talking about data sharing, we're talking about pre-crime algorithms, all that kind of stuff. So I think separating out the debate would help, and separating out the arguments around data sharing from government being able to issue a digital credential.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, please. I think that it's likely that the way that this announcement has been managed makes it irrecoverable for this government and potentially for the next 5 to 10 years. I'm afraid to say, I think the Prime Minister has killed support for digital ID. We can see that in the polls. We also see it in the fact that the petition, the e-petition on this issue is the 4th biggest petition in British history, second biggest petition on a non-Brexit issue. Your constituents are up in arms about it, and I think it is because of that, the way that it's been introduced, the fact that no one really believes it's about immigration and it might be about something else. And how poorly explained the system has been. In that sense, it also makes it very difficult to recommend safeguards because there isn't actually a policy here. There's been an announcement, and I've engaged with the government on digital ID issues, as I say, for a decade. I've spent many times in government offices with civil servants talking about how a system could be created. We have seen none of that reflected at all in what has happened over recent weeks with this announcement. There has been no detail. There is no substance. If we're talking about, in theory, what kinds of safeguards could any kind of theoretical digital ID system have, we could have a very long conversation about it. Certainly the starting point would be that it shouldn't be mandatory, that it should be optional. and that people can then take up a government-issued digital ID if they feel that it benefits them. That it should be something that they can exercise total control over, that they get to choose who sees their information, where, when, and for what purposes. And critically, as Ruth was saying as well, that we don't see a merging of government databases, which is a really big risk with digital ID systems. You know, the taxman can see your GP records, etc. Well, I have to say that is also an impetus with these systems, because the argument will be, well, why can't DWP see your health status? Why can't we integrate that? So in many different circumstances, there will be a strong impetus for that data to be shared, but that was something that would have to be very strongly legislated around to ensure that it couldn't happen.
Thank you. So I'm interested. So I have a background in the health service as a surgeon. So I'm interested in how the digital ID might link to the health record. You were talking about this just now, and it seems to me that if we could allow people ownership of their own health record, which was held digitally, that would give people agency over their own health care, and it would be an incentive for people to voluntarily take a digital ID, which would then be usable across different health agencies. Everybody has an NHS number, which is given to them when they're born. That might be a way into a system such as this. And it seems to me that encouraging people to engage in a digital ID system could be done by means of giving people agency over their own healthcare records, such that you were able to go between healthcare providers, hospitals and general practitioners with your own health record. And if you knew what was in your health record, a little bit more about your health, you would probably look after it a bit better. And so I would like to see the question of how the health record is incorporated into a digital ID spoken about a little bit more. Do you think that there's any mileage in thinking about it like that?
I mean, one thing I would say, you know, is as an organisation, we support people being able to access information about them that government holds. I think it is important that citizens are able to see the information that government holds about them, understand the basis of how decisions are made about them, and what information has been able to, you know, is used to make that decision, because that enables then people to challenge it when things go wrong. The problem you see with health data, and we looked at this in Wales for the Welsh Senedd. And we had examples where people were kind of worried then about going forward to their doctor because they're worried that data that they might give to their GP or healthcare professional might end up in the hands of immigration enforcement. So we saw issues with kind of migrant communities which were actually avoiding accessing healthcare because they were scared that it might then be used to check up on their status, or they might end up getting deported as a result of going to the doctor. So you see a situation where people lose trust in their healthcare professionals if they think their data is going to be shared with them. Med Confidential have done a huge amount of work around this over the years. So although there's benefits to an individual being able to access their own data, see how it's accessed and what purpose, I think there's massive risks about then sharing that data across the government and trying to like reimagine that data for different purposes. And you see this already, you know, and public are concerned about this. We see the outcry over some of the large US big tech companies like Panelist being involved in the delivery of NHS services and worry over how their data might go into AI systems, and that actually breeds further distrust in government from the population. So I agree with you, you know, people should be able to access their own data, but perhaps not share it amongst government without their consent.
I would agree with that, and also say that, you know, the legal position is that people have the right to access their health data. It could be presented in a much easier way for sure, but I would be very sceptical about that being used in a kind of carrot and stick situation where, you know, if you have easier access to your health data, then you enroll in a digital ID, which is actually something different to just accessing your health data. You should just be able to access and control your health data regardless of a digital ID.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that, I think there are two further things there. That one, then you get into the very tricky territory of what you do about those people who are digitally excluded, who aren't then, are they going to be at a disadvantage if they're not accessing their data in the same way, creating a two-tier system. But also the risk of, if you have this kind of system, you don't have the firewalls, as James mentioned, between health record and the Home Office, or indeed the Home Office and pretty much any other service. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner has spoken significantly about how sharing data with immigration officials with the Home Office deters survivors of domestic abuse and trafficking from coming forward and seeking the help that they so desperately need. So a firewall-first approach has to be integral to any system that the government is looking at.
Joni Reid.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to focus specifically on linking the digital ID to the right to work. I think you've been really clear on your kind of fundamental concerns and I suppose areas of principle which you disagree with. Is there any really specific concerns that you have around linking it to the right to work?
I mean, I'd say it has the potential to marginalise people from being able to participate in the economy. If something goes wrong with their digital ID, they're excluded from being able to earn a living. So that to me seems a real risk. We know that exclusion is a real problem that happens with these digital ID systems around the world. And we know that where it's been introduced already under the visa scheme for migrant workers, that is a problem that currently exists. So if you roll that out to the whole population, then anyone who already suffers some form of marginalisation, who might struggle to get digital ID, is then going to be, that's further going to be compounded because it's going to be an additional barrier to them accessing work and accessing the economy, which is going to increase chances of them falling into poverty or economic disadvantage. So I think there are particular concerns around gatekeeping the ability of every single British citizen's ability to go out there and earn a living behind some kind of digital system that they have to comply with and have to get over the barriers to access that. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, really, when you think about the history of our country. For years, people have been able to go out there and work, and now we're saying, no, you lose that right to work as a British citizen unless you do X, Y, Z with this digital system. Yes, by all means, employers have to have a system of checks that someone is who they say they are, and those are in place already, but it's an enforcement issue there around, not enough people going to check that people are doing the checks, rather than, an issue with how checks are done. So I think that there's massive concerns for us as an organisation around essentially, putting the right for someone to go out and work behind a digital ID firewall.
Yeah, I think this is what has been proposed is a multi-billion pound system, and I think it would be right to start with why rather than why not. And I don't think it washes that a British passport is not British enough or good enough documentation to have the right to work as people currently use, that instead you would need this new mandatory digital ID. We've seen with e-visas that has already locked people out of work because of the accessibility and technical problems that there have been with that scheme. So learning from that, aside from the principled issues and the rights issues and the lack of a basis for why this is necessary for right to work, we'd be very concerned about the practical implications of that. And bearing in mind that it's everyone from. The government's been talking about teenagers as well, so it could be somebody doing their first paper round up to a pensioner working in their garden centre. It's a massive, massive scope for who would then be forced into this mandatory digital ID scheme.
Agree with everything that other panellists have said. I suppose the other thing to add is that we know that rogue employers are still going to employ people without checking right to work. It's a solution that is not going to fix the problem that's being kind of spouted, and I think that speaks to, as Silkie said, the more general issue with some of the digital ID proposals that are coming out of the government, is that it's being touted as a solution to irregular immigration, illegal working, at one point fly tipping. This has echoes of the Blair government as well in the noughties, of saying that ID cards were going to fix pretty much any social problem of the day, and the government needs to be cautious not to use this as a kind of policy in search of a problem, which at the moment it feels like it's doing a little bit, and it's not going to fix those problems that it's saying it will.
Do you think there's any policy area in which digital ID would be justifiable in terms of supporting to help to enforce the law?
It's so difficult to answer that question because what is meant by digital ID is so different. Every country has got a different digital ID system. In theory, if you imagine, I mean, and every country is through its difficulties trying to do it, but in theory, you could design a system which was fairly privacy friendly, where government departments issued credentials to a variety of public and private sector wallets, and there was no tracking, and you had a really good human rights framework within which protected that, and you had a really good functioning information commissioner where if things go wrong, you know, they'd actually find someone for their mistakes and hold them to account. If you had all of those things in place, and you could imagine a system where it'd be more convenient for people to have it as an option on their like smartphone and have that choice between a physical ID and a digital ID, because there are some situations where using digital identity is quicker, and that already exists in society at the moment. You know, I already use, like I've used my bank credentials, for example, to do things. I've you know, booked plane tickets online and used digital credentials to do that kind of stuff. So are those kind of systems in place already? And obviously some of those are quicker than going somewhere in person with a physical ID. But you have to have all of those other things in place in terms of your rights framework, your data protection in place first in order to make it work.
I don't think, I'm not really sure that there's, I mean, I've never heard an argument that, you know, we could enforce this area of the law so much better if only it were that we had mandatory digital IDs. It's just not something that I've come across, unless you go to a very extreme end of the surveillance spectrum. And that's one of the things that I'm really worried about here, in so much as what we do know about the digital ID system proposed is that it will be basically a massive facial recognition system, because it would be linked to facial biometrics. That's one of the only substantive things we've been told about this government proposal. So that means that you would have around 50 million British adults with their sensitive personal biometric data in a system, and quite unusually as well, lots of foreign nationals as well, millions of foreign nationals. It's not actually a British only system because it relates to everyone who's working here. And given that this has been introduced at a time when the government is also backing a significant expansion of facial recognition surveillance in this country, and that we have also found, without discussing with Parliament, the government is now using the passport database for facial recognition searches, I'd be very worried about how, as you say, from a law enforcement perspective, this new gargantuan biometric system could also be used for that extension of surveillance.
No, I mean, there isn't a model of digital ID that a civil liberties organisation would support that would specifically meet that policy objective, because when we look at a good system, we look at something that is voluntary, that has firewalls, so yeah.
That's very clear, thank you. Can I just pick up on, you've mentioned the e-visas quite a few times. Is there anything beyond, you've talked about people being locked out of work and because the system has broken down or whatever. Is there any other impacts on the individuals who've used e-visas beyond the examples that you've given so far?
Yeah, you have to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been examples, I think, where you know, issues of domestic abuse, where someone in a household where the e-visa is denied them because essentially it's on a phone, and then an abusive partner kind of controls that device and access to it. So there's potential there for these digital systems to exact, because you can control people through their digital access of devices. You know, so that there's issues with it there. We've had issues of function creep, so private sector organisations demanding that people produce their e-visas in situations where they're not required, so in the process of applying for the job rather than like whether they've got the job. That example I gave where someone has been essentially stopped from buying alcohol because they couldn't get an internet access and show their e-visa share code, and that is an example of a private sector organisation taking it upon themselves to enact, you know, a government mandated digital ID to deliver their service. So, you know, they're the examples I'd give of where it's hurt people in the real world.
There's a brilliant report by a group called the 3 Million that has just been published called Digital Status Crisis, which has a lot of important information and case studies in this area. It seems to me, in terms of the most applicable areas from that report, the areas that are most applicable to digital ID. One is the data matching issues. So people are logging in to their e-visa and finding that it's somebody else's migration status is somebody else's photograph. So there are just very basic data issues. And then the second tier of issues is around access failures. Whether that's on the user side, obvious things like if your phone runs out of battery, you don't have good internet access, but also on the system side, if there's a system issue. And then people are finding it very, very hard to get in touch with the Home Office and try and do something about it. So there are case studies in this report where people have been locked out of work, travel, education, for example.
Yeah, and in addition to that, people being wrongly told they have refugee status, being unable to travel back to the UK from holiday, being charged with NHS treatment when they shouldn't be, kind of untold human misery that this system not working has caused, and really highlights the risk of creating a digital product like this. I'm sure that many of you, through casework or through family or friends, have supported people to apply for an e-visa. It is a nightmare. It is so difficult to do. For the most digitally literate, for people who work in the sector, it is unbelievably hard. And it is a perfect illustration of how a poorly designed mandatory system leaves people at an enormous disadvantage.
Do you think the problems there are intrinsic, or do you think that a far better system can be designed that doesn't have these problems?
I think the starting place is wrong. So if you don't approach it from a place of how do we make this a system that is going to improve access to services, it's going to work for people, it's going to centre human rights, if you start from that place, then you might be able to build something much better. But this has been built from the wrong starting point.
I'll just add one thing, like the larger the systems get, that creates other problems as well. So this is, Estonia's a couple million people, the e-visa scheme's about 4 million people roughly. What the government's talking about here is a system that would be 50, 60, 70 million people. So some of those problems expand the larger the data set, issues of duplicate records, matching people, biometric mismatches, all of that stuff. And you see that in the India scheme. It's not necessarily a unique ID, because someone in India, they can match for about 1,200 other people through the biometric mismatching, because these systems are not perfect in matching someone's biometric credentials. So if you're using something like facial biometrics, which is proposed here, there will just be the scale of a population. There will be a lot of mismatches and problems when you scale it up. So
are you finished, Joni?
I am, thank
so
you.
Lewis Atkinson wants to come in, Chi wants to come in, I think Peter wants to come in as well. And I'm conscious we've not got that long, but let's start with Lewis.
Thank you. Can I just be really clear on the mandatory work checks? So I hear really clearly that obviously you're against mandatory digital ID for those. I think that's taken as read. I think you heard the last panel talk about a potential interpretation or policy direction of government would be to say that there has to be mandatory work checks checked with government, which could be via a digital ID for those who choose to take up one, but could also be done via other means, i.e. passport, etc., but checked back to government. So could I just put that to you and say how you would react to that and how far you think that would mitigate some of the privacy and other concerns that you have?
I think, allowing people a multitude of ways to prove their ability to work would be great. Not making them rely on e-visa if they've got passport, driver's license, anything else would be fantastic and really sensible thing to do. I'd raise a little bit of concern as to what then happens with that data that goes back to government and what's it being used for. Is that going into like an AI algorithmic system to try and automatically detect discrepancies with their bank accounts to work out who is or isn't illegal working? Because if that's the intention, then you're going to start flagging a load of people wrongly and wrongly persecuting a load of people, as we saw recently with the scandal with HMRC, where people leaving the country got flagged as not entitled to their benefits, and they were. So I'd say, what is that data then going to be used for, and what purpose? That's the real question there.
I agree with that, and it would seem strange that as it currently stands, you can use a British passport for a right to work check, you can use it to travel, you can use it to open a bank account, financial services, etc., but that it wouldn't be good enough for somebody to do a paper round, that you'd have to have this extra layer of government checks. And it seems that likewise that would be likely to sprawl, because if you need a government check for that, then why not for other things like healthcare and renting and other areas. So I completely agree, having a multitude of ways to identify yourself is a very good thing. If the government wants to offer people some form of a digital identity in a very, very different way, some people will find that helpful. But having a government linked to that data raises many of the same concerns as a mandatory digital ID.
Maura.
Just to follow up on that, because I have concerns about digital ID, as I've set out, but you seem to be saying that any form of digital ID is concerning. You seem to be opposed to any form of digital ID, and it has to be said, that paper-based systems, which was what the Windrush system was originally, have big concerns and have caused many problems for constituents as well. So can you just, I think Ruth, you said that you would start from a different place. You would start from designing it in human, based on supporting human rights. But can you just confirm that you are not opposed in principle to any form of digital ID, and say perhaps a little bit about what would make it work for your organisation?
Yeah, so no, Liberty is not opposed to all forms of digital ID. We think there, in fact, is a way of creating a system whereby people can share less data about themselves in a more helpful way. We talked about that a bit on the last panel. But when you go to rent a property, you give your letting agent a huge amount of data that they don't need. And there's a way to create a system that is much more narrow. But as the principles that digital ID system would need to follow is that is voluntary, not to hammer home the point, that it's opt-in, that it's kind of privacy protected, privacy first. So we have data, we have firewalls to stop data sharing between government departments that don't need to be sharing the data. That it's GDPR compliant, so kind of has those privacy by design principles, and that's kind of the baseline of what we would need to see.
Okay.
I started by saying that digital identity is something that many of us use every single day, and I do, so there's not an in principle aversion to digital identity per se at all, but it is our job as human rights defenders to look at, when you have a government scheme, especially a mandatory government scheme, to identify where those risks are.
Yes, but you're not opposed to a government digital ID scheme in principle?
In principle, it's possible for the government to offer people a digital identity that they could choose to use. But that is a very, very broad conversation, I think, a million miles away from what has been proposed by this government.
Same kind of position, really. I think we're in danger perhaps of losing some of the institutional memory around how to do this right, because there was the privacy advisory group that came up with the kind of principles around how to do identity assurance, and they were kind of published, and they're still on DCIT's webpage, and there's a whole list of those are there already. So work has been done around how you could do this in a better way that respected people's rights. I think if it were voluntary, if it were something that I could choose to have or not, and I was able to kind of see the code behind the wallet, and I could choose what wallet I wanted to issue to, and it wasn't about kind of data sharing and my data then being used for other purposes, I'd be far more willing to accept something like that. But that isn't the scheme that appears to be on the table at the moment, but possibly things can change.
Peter Prinsley.
I think you have really reflected what I was going to ask, which is, it seems to me that you're not opposed to a voluntary digital ID system for this country that people can opt into, provided it had certain safeguards about how the data was distributed and used. So my question is that if we were to create a voluntary opt-in digital ID service for the British people, what proportion of the British people do you think would be interested in adopting such a system? Do you think it would be like 5%, or do you think it would grow?
It would depend in some ways. I mean, the danger is you'd have function creep, right? So that example I gave earlier of someone being required to use their e-visa to buy alcohol. You might see Ticketmaster, I buy a ticket, or some other organisation say, well, actually, no, we're only going to accept that digital ID now. So you'd have to legislate in a way that didn't discriminate against people who chose not to have digital ID. And you'd also have to find a way that a future government couldn't come along and change the parameters of that digital ID to make it quite a abhorrent thing that would be not the type of system most of us would want to see in a country. So they're a lot of a risk. You have to think about what's the actual rights framework and the data protection safeguards that exist within society in order to make this a safe thing. And I think if you got those things right, you see higher adoption. But if you had a society where data protection breaches go unpunished, human rights aren't respected, then you'd see a lot more scepticism and resistance from people uptaking.
In the first panel, we heard about many of the advantages of digital ID, and in this panel, I think we've been well appraised of the problems. You've been very successful with that venture. But I think that if people could be made to see the advantages for themselves as individuals, my guess is that with appropriate safeguards, adoption would extend. Do you agree with that?
I think the language that you say made to see, I think people can see for themselves whether they trust something or they don't trust it.
Yes.
And unfortunately this scheme, you see from the petition and the way people reacted, they don't trust it. Perhaps in the future if there's another scheme which has people's trust, but also people trust the entire rights framework and the data protection framework behind it, then you might see people then adopt it and enjoy the benefits of it.
I think currently none of our lives are adversely affected by not having a government-issued digital ID. And many of us have government-issued identity documents that we use in different scenarios, like passport, for instance. We've got birth certificates, etc. And so it does seem like a policy in search of a problem to solve. What I would then worry about is when you say, for example, making people see the benefits, and you spoke about health data being used, that what has happened with other voluntary schemes, like the Aadhaar scheme in India, for example, it ostensibly is voluntary. In practice, it is not. Everyone has to have it to access basic services, and so you can end up with a situation where something was introduced in a voluntary way that then actually is used to gatekeep many different services. Again, if you think about the situation that we would have been in if we had a digital ID system when the pandemic started, obviously there are ways in which the ID then would have been used in that circumstance, because we had track and trace, we had vaccine passports, etc. And I think the risk is that in response to any future moral panic, that there will be a temptation to say, well, why don't we add this to the digital ID, or why don't we use it in this way? And we have seen that from some of the examples around the world.
I think seeing the public's response to the government's announcement shows that we are a nation still very sceptical of any kind of mandatory ID, which obviously is lovely for organisations like Big Brother Watch and Liberty to see. But I would say that the government could look to the EU approach to digital ID, which prioritises privacy and security, to look for ways to ensure that a system is built that where the user has control over their data, where it's genuinely voluntary, where there are safeguards in place to protect against discrimination for people who choose not to opt in. So there are models that are better than others, which are obviously always worth looking at.
Lewis Atkinson, finally, on digital exclusion.
Thank you. So could you just outline how you think the government should account for digital exclusion when developing its plans for digital ID, whether that be mandatory or indeed not mandatory?
One simple thing, don't make it mandatory. That immediately means that all of those people who might be excluded by your design choices around technology, the operating system it can work on, how that software, even getting the photograph is a challenge for some people. With e-visas, we heard examples of people with severe learning disabilities, autism. It's hard just to get them to sit still, to take the photograph needed in the right style, etc. So not making it mandatory, it massively makes it easier for the government to tackle a load of those digital exclusion issues, really.
I agree with that, and also the facial recognition aspect could introduce some exclusion factors because of the issues that there have been with misidentifications and facial recognition, particularly around race and gender, and also certain disabilities. But also, inclusion in a system doesn't always need to mean that people are forced into a digital or a technological system, for example. I think there would have to be an offline alternative for the many, many people who don't have good connectivity, who don't have good digital skills, but also to acknowledge there are many people that don't want to be forced into a system like that don't want to have smartphones. I mean, the whole conversation around smartphones is changing as well, but the idea is that everyone would have a smartphone with a very, very essential piece of data on it. And I think that might not stand the test of time as well.
Yeah, I mean, the question of digital exclusion goes beyond the remit of liberty in many ways, because we're talking about poverty more generally and lack of access to good connection. But I think, just touching on what Silkie said, even having a mandatory system where there's a fallback of having a physical ID card, the government's own research, previous government's own research in the run-up to the previous election on voter ID showed that there are already massive barriers for people who are excluded through, yes, having disabilities, being unemployed, people without qualifications, first-time voters. That cohort of people are much less likely to have any form of ID. So it's not as simple as creating a system with just an option to have a paper ID.
Thank you very much. Is there anything you want to add? Is there anything that you feel that came out from the previous panel that you would like to respond to?
I mean, just one point, you know, we've talked here about the personal privacy risks, but I also think there is a cybersecurity risk for the whole nation, in terms of the more you make everyone reliant on a particular way of doing digital ID, the more you increase attack vectors for a foreign adversary to try and take out that system and target it in an act of cyber warfare. So I'd really say, you know, the system of mandatory, non-mandatory isn't just about digital exclusion or the individual rights. It's also about building systems that are resilient to foreign attack and can carry on working in a disaster situation. To go back to an analogy, you know, lifts, digital ID might be lifts, but we still want stairs in the case of a fire or something. You need alternatives.
Anything? Well, can I thank you very much for the second panel for your contributions. I found it incredibly interesting and informative, and certainly as an opening piece of oral evidence for this inquiry, it's been a real, very, very good way of starting us off in terms of our next steps. So thank you again. Order.